Without further ado, and on behalf of the Bavarian American Academy and LMU's Amerika Institute, I welcome Professor Stephen Hoelscher. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kirsten, for that wonderful introduction and for inviting me to be here today. And what a great day it's been. The conference that you and Nicole organized has been incredibly interesting, and every talk has been memorable and very much worth ongoing conversation. So it's truly an honor to be here to bring us home. So I want to talk about the long history of photography to begin with. I think it's very important to recognize that the American environment has been well represented in the photographic record. Ever since its early 19th century invention, photography has been called upon to visualize the nation's immense geographic variation. So closely entwined are photography and our perception of the environment that it's difficult to think of one without the other. It's revealing, for instance, that the earliest surviving photographs by Niepce in 1827, by Daguerre in 1838, depicted landscapes. Indeed, as soon as Daguerre introduced his photographic process to the world, Americans immediately began making daguerreotypes of every available outdoor scene. A close look at one of those photographers serves, I think, as a useful introduction to a medium that has changed dramatically over the last 2 centuries, but whose ubiquity in picturing environments is utterly taken for granted. The story of an itinerant photographer named Thomas Easterly, who settled in St. Louis in 1848 and who operated a daguerreotype studio in his adopted city for the next 30 years, suggests the power of landscape photography to shape understandings of the environment. Like other photographers of his day, Easterly provided portraits for a rapidly growing population. What set him apart was his peculiar devotion to things of the past, a nostalgia that applied not just to his working methods. He continued to use his daguerreotype outfit long after most photographers had made the move to more modern processes, but also to his subject matter, where his peers expanded their fields of vision to include what boosters call the grand vistas and the classical glories of the booming city. The unconventional daguerreotypist focused more on what was being lost. These included pictures of the transformation of a local landmark called Big Mound. At 34 feet high, 319 feet long, 158 feet wide, and is one of the last remaining earthen burial sites of the Mississippian culture, the mound was, as one early St. Louis historian put it, quote, one of the most striking and remarkable features of the landscape. In the mid-19th century, the mound was steadily scraped away to provide material for local building projects. Its slow, constant destruction kicked into overdrive with the arrival of the North Missouri Railroad, when workers rapidly removed the artifact-laden earth to use as fill for the railway bed. By 1870, the mound had been completely reconfigured into yet one more building location for the bustling city. Easterly recorded this dramatic environmental transformation with striking precision, making 14 photographs over a nearly 20-year period. His earliest, shown here from 1852, already shows a modified landscape with vertical striations of earth removed from the mound. The scene is quiet with a street lamp, several wagons, 2 people faintly visible in the background, perhaps included for scale. By contrast, his photographs over the next 17 years show a radically altered landscape. And I'm just going to show 3 of those. And I have to ask, what would Edward Baczynski think of this? Crowds of people have now come to the ever-diminishing mound, making something of a spectacle of both the landscape's description destruction and the picture-making event. Whittled away to a mere fragment of its former self, the mound increasingly functioned as a backdrop for citizens of St. Louis to mark their apparent triumph in sculpting their environment. Local excitement about the mound's destruction was surely less of a concern over the loss of a notable feature in the landscape than one city's headlong rush into a boomtown future. Using his severely outdated daguerreotype camera to visualize a cultural embrace of the future that he apparently did not share, Easterly's photographs sound an odd note of regret. As historian Martha Sandweiss notes, they are nearly alone among 19th century photographs that implicitly denounce an active and deliberate assault at Indian culture and environmental destruction. That regret most likely went largely unnoticed. There was no lawsuit here. What did attract attention was how Easterly's photographs encouraged people at the time to understand themselves as participants in the historic project of shaping their environment. Influenced by technological opportunities and constraints, guided by prevailing cultural norms, but also pushing back against the grain, and shaped by aesthetic choices, each of these factors plays an important role in how Thomas Easterly photographed Big Mound's environmental destruction. They can be interpreted in very different ways, of course. At the time, as a celebration of the human capacity to shape the environment, and today, as sad reminders of what is lost. Another way to put it is that Easterly's pictures offer a remarkable example of how one photographer visualized the landscape. And here let's move on to Ansel Adams. 100 years later, Ansel Adams expressed his own picture-making process in exactly these terms. He wrote, "The first step towards visualization, and hence towards expressive interpretation, is to become aware of the world around us in terms of the photographic image." The differences between the daguerreotypist, who meticulously documented an environment's destruction, and the landscape photographer, who championed nature preservation by removing change and people from view, could hardly be greater, of course. But the extent to which they made pictures that explicitly engage with the aesthetics and politics of environmental photography makes for a striking comparison. Exploring that connection, in fact, was the goal of a recent photography exhibition that I organized and that will serve as the basis for my talk tonight. And I have to say, it's sad, but the exhibition closed 2 days ago. And it's sad because, you work so hard to put something together and, there has to be a new exhibition. But I'm very proud of it, and it will serve as the basis of what I'm going to talk about tonight. And I should say, I'm not trained as in when we go to museums. But here I'm in a different position of actually creating something. And it's that engagement with creating this exhibition that I would be very happy to talk about tonight. Beginning with Adams as my conceptual starting point, I'm interested in this exhibition and in my talk tonight in how photographers have shaped multiple visual narratives of the American environment. His photographs of pristine nature, captured with razor-sharp focus, subtle gradations of light and dark, operatic grand vision, and deep recessions of space, remain some of the most iconic environmental images of our time. We've seen a few of these earlier, but I'm just going to show a few now. If you've not seen them, they look great on the screen, but they look even better in the gallery, I must say. Within both the history of photography and of American popular culture more generally, it's difficult to overstate his significance. Though it must be noted, and this is a point that I emphasized later in his talk, that influence is not uncontroversial. And this brings us back to our very first talk today, this morning, about the limitations of Ansel Adams, and that will absolutely be part of the discussion tonight. What's most interesting to me, however, about Adams is not what his followers, who are legion, have called his singular brilliance, but rather how his work fits into a historical continuum of environmental photography. And so this is a map that I made showing the location of all the photographs from the exhibition. And you can see the ones in green by Ansel Adams. The purple ones show both his predecessors and those who came after. So I really did try to contextualize Adams as best I could. And so this contextualization includes those who came before him and whose legacy he embodied and transformed, and those who came after and who worked in his long shadow, cast by his exceptionally influential career. This concept provides the structure for the exhibit and what I'm about to talk about for the next 40 minutes. So let's begin. We enter the gallery, and this is the first exhibition that we see. I begin with Ansel Adams and an early portfolio. And my gosh, we're so fortunate to have this at this archive. This is exceptionally rare at this point, this particular portfolio. It's both formative and seemingly unusual. His 1929 Sierra Club outing is an early example of a format that he came to value greatly. A portfolio of unbound photographic prints comprised of a series of original fine prints painstakingly produced by Adams himself in the darkroom or in later used by an assistant under his direction. Portfolios became Adams' preferred means of distributing his prints. And this makes him so totally different than, say, Brzezinski, whose photographs are going to be as large as that wall. These are small, and they're meant to be viewed slowly and up close. Later, he produced larger prints, but the vast majority of his career were smaller ones. And I wanted to emphasize that by showing this portfolio. They were also crystallizations of his artistic vision. Critics view his portfolios as some of his most intimate expressions of his work. With prints of a portfolio, Adams intended for them to be viewed slowly and up close. Most of the 25 photographs from his 1929 portfolio were taken during the Sierra Club's annual outing, a month-long hiking trip and camping trip into the mountains surrounding Yosemite. And just a word about this. I mean, this is not a small-scale backpacking trip with me and a couple of my friends. This is all of us, plus this group again, plus this group again. 200 of us going into Yosemite, being there for a month, setting up camp, having plays in the evening, opera, entertainment, and then we go climb mountains. This was really how the Sierra Club was created in the 19th century, and as it evolved into Adams' own time, was appointed the trip's official photographer, one of his first commissioned assignments. And in many ways, the photographs resemble the kind of personal experiences of a hiking trip, showing scenes in the camp, along the trail, and from an ascended mountain peak. And this just shows some of them. So this is part of the crowd, I mean, hanging out by the commissary. These are not what we typically think of as classic Ansel Adams photographs. I mean, I'm not saying that I'm a great photographer, but this is a photograph that I might take when I'm hiking with my buddies, and he does this. But he also included something really special in this portfolio, because pretty soon he would turn the corner on this sort of photography. And I don't know if you can see it. It's easier to see on the wall against a white mat, but these are sort of off-white. He's using textured paper of the kind that one would have found published with more artsy, pointillist photographs from Edward Steichen. So it's a different kind of paper, but we begin to see elements of a modernist sensibility. But what really does it is his amazing photograph, Monolith, which is what he determined to be his first great photograph. I've got a lot more that I can say about this, and I do say this in a companion GIS that goes along with the exhibition. Somebody asked me recently if I published along with the exhibition. Well, I didn't publish a book, but I did publish it in what I think is a really interesting GIS. And I don't have time to look at this now, but I'd be very happy to at the conclusion if somebody's interested. You can go on to this, and this is a three-dimensional visualization through GIS, Geographic Information System, using aerial photographs, satellite imagery, and topographical maps based on the best information we have about exactly where the photograph was taken, and we paired it up with every single photograph in the exhibition. So we get a different kind of visualization of the environment that Adams photographed. And most importantly is, we do know from his diaries exactly the day and exactly the time and exactly the location where he stood. And thanks to the wonders of science, we know that it was a beautiful blue sky day, which is what it looks like on our visualization. It sure does not look like the brooding, gloomy, black-skied form that he worked so hard to create. And again, we can talk about that a little bit later if there's interest. Adams first visited Yosemite in 1916. And as he often noted, the encounter changed his life. I knew my destiny, he wrote many years later, when I first experienced Yosemite. The place became his spiritual, social, and economic center, and for the rest of his life, he returned there as often as possible. Like many middle-class Americans, the young 14-year-old Adams brought a camera on this momentous 1916 trip, a Kodak Brownie. The pictures he made, snapshots intended to serve as mementos of a memorable family vacation, would surely not be considered art, but they reminded him of a location that became central to his professional and personal life. Over the years, Adams developed a deep sense of place with Yosemite that became the foundation for his photographic work. And I'll just show several of the photographs from the exhibition in the space that focuses on Yosemite. The high mountain peaks, wildly rushing waterfalls, changing atmospheric conditions, lush valley floors became the source material for a new way of making environmental visualizations. Landscapes of pictorial patterns, shapes, gradations of tones that evoked Adams' own deeply personal affiliation with the place. While Yosemite remained important for Adams during his long career, he also photographed landscapes beyond the iconic California National Park. Travels through the American West, including to other national parks, provided opportunities to expand his photographic subjects. By the early 1940s, with the benefit of these new experiences, his visual approach changed considerably, becoming what we now recognize as his mature style. And what I mean by that is comparing it to the 1929 Sierra Club album. In this new approach, Adams departs from the warm, intimate look of that portfolio, creating instead a more dramatic visualization of the environment. Some could be close up, some could be more distant. But in each of these, I think, a sense of awe and astonishment became his signature qualities of these photographs. He was drawn to environments that showcased visible weather patterns like theatrical clouds and snowstorms, to landforms that emphasized intense effects of light and dark, to waterways and forests that in different ways contained a dynamism and sense of energy. For Adams, focusing on the pristine quality of the environment kept the impact of people on the natural world at a distance, largely removed from the scene. And of course, his photographs have nothing to say about the original inhabitants of this land or their forceful removal. This was quite intentional, and this critical choice had a profound effect on his work. In his photographs, Adams transformed what he saw in the environment into what he hoped would be an inspirational work of art. This is what he said, quote, "A great photograph is one that fully expresses what one feels in the deepest sense about what is being photographed." And what Adams felt was an intense, you might even say, mystical experience of being in the natural world. Translating those feelings into political action became a key, complicated element of his work. To dig into this point, I'd like to consider his magisterial Clearing Winter Storm photograph from 1944. This photograph is often seen as an environmental statement. Adams wrote, he said, quote, "But I do not recall that I ever intentionally made a photograph for environmentally significant purposes," unquote. Rather, if we take him at his word, Adams made photographs such as this with artistic intentions, but over the years, he and others have used these very photographs for environmental purposes. He continued, quote, "My photographs that are considered to relate to environmental issues are images conceived by him for their artistic and emotional qualities, whatever they may be," unquote. I've noted how Adams frequently sought dramatic weather patterns to enliven his pictures, but I think it's important to underscore how exceedingly difficult it was to make this photograph. The rapidly changing conditions made setting up the large view camera and producing a compelling negative demanding, a challenge matched by the complexity of printing from the negative. The result is a work of art that is far removed from pure documentation, and this is really an important point tonight. He says that, quote, "This photograph is realistic only in the reference to the image of the lens." In other words, it's very much a construction, an artistic construction. The constructed artistic nature of his photographs did not stop Adams from enlisting them for environmental purposes. In his brand of environmental photography, aesthetics can be a political tool. He said with great conviction that, quote, response to natural beauty is one of the foundations of the environmental movement," unquote. This was certainly on vivid display in his 1960 book, This is the American Earth. Published by the Sierra Club and distributed by New York publishing giant Alfred A. Knopf, the book was the culmination of a 6-year collaboration between Adams and curator Nancy Newhall. The project began with a photography exhibition at Yosemite National Park's Conservation Lodge, which then later traveled internationally to the United States Information Agency. And so I'm wondering, maybe it arrived here at the amerikahaus in 1958. It certainly may have. This would have been one of the things I think that the amerikahaus would have been interested in doing. The book, exquisitely printed and bound in a large 14 by 11 size, was the first of the Sierra Club's exhibition format series. It follows a chronological narrative with biblical creation to contemporary America beset by environmental destruction. Newhall's text, an environmental manifesto in free verse form, provided a narrative structure that paralleled the photographic image. Adams and Newhall selected 43 of his own photographs, nearly all of which showed his characteristic focus on beauty of the natural world. The other half of the book, 41 photographs in total, drew from the visual archives of 30 other photographers. Rather than end with apocalyptic destruction, it concludes with a plea to conserve the crucial resource, the American natural environment. And I was tempted to actually, after your talk, to actually go and pull one of those from the exhibition and put it in my PowerPoint. But I took your advice, and maybe being a little bit sparse is the right approach, because the whole book is sort of juxtaposing this photograph to photographs of environmental destruction, brutally just suburban sprawl and the worst things that are happening to the American environment. So he was very aware of that sort of dichotomy, but he just chose not to photograph it. But he included it in the book right here. This is the American Earth, proved to be remarkably successful, selling approximately 75,000 copies. With the financial support of the industrialist and conservationist Max McGraw and the McGraw Foundation, the Sierra Club sent copies of the book to all 537 members of Congress as part of a campaign to pass the Wilderness Act. And in the archive of the Ransom Center, we've got the Alfred A. Knopf papers so we can trace the distribution of this book. So David Brower, who was the secretary of the Sierra Club at that time, wrote to every member of Congress attached to the book. This book has been in preparation for at least 4 years, and it is especially timely that we should have reached its ultimate state right now when you have before you the Wilderness Bill, itself a product of nearly 10 years of careful preparation. If you still have any doubts about what is at stake, I pray that you will. I love how to read a book. And it's true. You want to take time with this. But so the didacticism is funny. But anyways, I pray that you will wall yourself off from the bustle of your days for perhaps 3 hours and consider the counterpoint in what these two great artists present in the book. And people did respond very, very favorably to it. The archive is filled with letters such as this one from Republican Archer Nelson from Minnesota, who said, "This is one of the most beautifully prepared books that I've seen in a long time. The photography is magnificent and the text wonderfully stirring. Being a farmer and a conservationist, the book has particular meaning for me, and you'll be sure that it'll be one that I treasure and share." Similarly, then, they sent it to newspapers around the country, who then wrote editorials out of it. And I'm not going to make a causal argument, but it is true that the Wilderness Act was passed 4 years later, and it did seem to demonstrate that photography could play a role in environmental activism. So let's move on to the next gallery. And isn't this a great picture by Cedric Wright? My God, I love this. This is not in our archive. I had to get it from the CCP, but I just couldn't do the exhibition without this one. Ansel Adams' environmental visualizations exemplify the photographic practices of 2 centuries. On one hand, he mastered the techniques and equipment of 19th century photography, with its frequent use of large format cameras and the creation of individual prints for public distribution. At the same time, he became an articulate 20th century spokesman for photography to be treated as a fine art. Of course, we take that for granted today, but it was not something that was settled in the early 20th century. Adams' belief in the power of photographic visualization to inspire reverence for the natural environment set him apart from most of his 19th century predecessors. Many of their photographs, by contrast, focused on presenting topographical or commercial views of the landscape. Recall here Thomas Easterly's daguerreotypes of Big Mound destruction. Let's look at several types in this portion of the gallery. First are photographs that are intended for railway companies to advertise scenic wonders along their lines. The photograph that this couple is looking at in the exhibition. I'll present to you this photograph by F.J. Haynes. In 1876, Haynes became, first of all, he worked for the Northern Pacific Railway, providing publicity photographs and serigraphic views for sites along the railway. And this commercial work then caught the attention of the superintendent of the recently created Yellowstone National Park, who offered Haynes the position as park's first official photographer. His job was to provide a comprehensive survey of the park's astonishing alien features that had only been drawn and written about. Beginning in 1881, Haynes spent considerable time in the park capturing notable sites, including Minerva Terrace. And so when I lead student tours through this exhibition, I often stop here. And by now, we've gone through the Ansel Adams portion of the gallery. We're going back in time, looking at the 19th century. And I ask them, so how do you know that this is not an Ansel Adams photograph? So I'll pose that question now to you. How do you know that this is not an Ansel Adams photograph? Would Ansel be caught dead with a dude right there, admit? He would wait all day until this gentleman left. But of course, Haynes wanted him there because he lent scale to this amazing terrace. So, I mean, part of it is simply aesthetics, but the purpose of this was different than what Adams was trying to do. This was really to call attention to a beautiful landscape, and perhaps, as a visitor, to imagine yourself walking through this amazing landscape. Again, nothing that Adams himself would do. At the same time, between 1867 and 1879, 4 great surveys were commissioned by the U.S. government to provide geographic information about the newly acquired land in the American West. Organized tellingly by the U.S. War Department, we'll come back to that in a second, each employed photographers like Timothy O'Sullivan to document these environments. And if you know about the history of American photography, O'Sullivan's name pops up. He was one of the iconic photographers of the Civil War, and you've perhaps seen in history textbooks the brutal photograph of the harvest of death at Gettysburg. That's O'Sullivan. So most of these photographers on the surveys were, many of them, not all, but many of them were previously photographing aftermath scenes during the Civil War. So O'Sullivan was on this survey, and his job was to document the environment. And central to that project, you would not know it from the photograph itself, central to that project was the forceful colonization of contested land. And you look at the photograph itself, and it doesn't show it whatsoever. But this being a federal government document, you turn the book over, there's an extended caption on the back side, and that's what we historians have to read to figure out what's going on here. I'm not good enough to be able to really just interpret this. I need words to help me. And this is what the extended caption said in 1873. This was not written, I'm sure, by O'Sullivan, by somebody in the War Department. It is only within the last few years that the whites, except in large bodies, have been able to enter the Sierra Blanca region on account of the hostile Apaches who were at home there. In the early part of 1873, they were finally subjugated by General Crook in a continuous war of several years. After their conquest, they were put under discipline upon different reservations, on one of which the accompanying picture is located. There, through the agency of General Crook, they have been instructed to the various arts of peaceful self-support. Up to the present date, however, the fruits of their labors have been not sufficient for their sustenance, and they have been dependent on the government for supplies of food. Well, it would be hard-pressed to find a better example of what we today would call settler colonialism, to which photography played a very central role in the 19th century in the American West. A slight variation were government entities as they spoke to corporate interests. Now, this is one that I mentioned. Oh, here we are, the Carlton Watkins. I mean, when I bring visitors through the gallery, and I like to say, if there's one photograph that I could take home with me, it would be this. This is so amazing. It's in perfect condition. And there it is, one of the great photographs of Yosemite from 1865. So Watkins, he became the official photographer for the California State Geological Survey of 1865. When he wasn't making photographs of Yosemite, he documented the industrial economic fallout of the gold rush. And this is the photograph that I was promising that we'd take a look at later. And it's a little bit different than the version that we saw taken 10 years later in 1882, the 1882 trial that Connor Scott told us about this morning. This image of the North Bloomfield Mining and Gravel Company work site, which operated a hydraulic gold mining outfit in the Malakoff mine beginning in 1866, provided reference for the company's then enormous size, expense, and output. When viewed today, of course, it stands out as an early testament to dramatic environmental change. At that time, this photograph, unlike the one that we saw from 1882, was explicitly made to demonstrate economic progress. And you get a sense of the scale here. I mean, that's a person. So you really do need to get a sense of the scale to understand the massive environmental transformation that Watkins captured here. Third are photographs intended for individual and corporate businesses to satisfy middle-class demands for visual information about American environments. Especially important are the mass-produced stereographs. One good example of someone who's producing stereographs was William Henry Jackson, whose long career focused on environments of the American West. This included Colorado, where he opened a commercial photography studio in Denver in 1879. Before that, though, he worked for the Union Pacific Railroad and for several U.S. surveys of the West. These included the 1871 survey led by Ferdinand Hayden, which played a prominent role in establishing Yellowstone National Park. Jackson also produced scores of stereographs, like the one that this gentleman is looking through, but also photographs of a very different genre. In his youth, Jackson was trained as a painter, a skill that he brought to this photograph of the gateway to Pikes Peak. For a brief period before the invention of the new process of creating color photographs, artists like Jackson hand-painted their prints to make them look more realistic and appealing to potential clients. I'll leave it to you to decide if hand-painting it improves the photograph. But certainly at that time, the attempt was to make it more artistic and also more realistic. I now move on to the third portion of the exhibition and of my talk tonight by visiting the Contemporary Gallery. Last summer, the U.S. Postal Service commemorated Ansel Adams' work with the release of 16 forever stamps featuring his photographs. These are actually really hard to get. Every time I go to a post office, I ask, do you have Ansel Adams stamps? They're always sold out. This is only the latest testament to his enormous impact on American visual culture. But his immeasurable influence on both the photographic and environmentalist worlds began early and did not go unchallenged. Even at the beginning of his career, Adams was developing his recognizable style. Photographers visualize the environment in quite different ways. For many contemporary photographers, Adams' legacy represents both a debt and a burden. Contemporary landscape photographer Mark Klett describes how Adams helped both raise environmental consciousness and prove that photography could be a powerful medium for that project. At the same time, by removing evidence of the human impact on the earth, Adams presented a romanticized vision of a lost world, an aesthetic with few contemporary adherents. Klett puts it this way, quote, "The landscape is not so much a paradise to long for, some say a paradise lost, as it is a mirror that reflects our own cultural image. The reality of place is quite different than what one sees in an Ansel Adams photograph, unquote. Trying to visualize the environment in ways that represent myriad realities of place has become a hallmark of photography in recent decades, and in many ways, it is a direct critique of Adams. The photographs to illustrate this key point in the exhibition take on many forms and address a wide range of topics, including destruction and degradation, change over time, the connection of home to place, historical memory, and aesthetic beauty. In every case, rather than separating cultures and societies from the environment, contemporary environmental visualizations explore their connection. They visually exemplify what William Cronin's now famous dictum that wilderness is the wrong nature to get back to. In my time remaining, I'll highlight several of these environmental photographic interventions. And I want to begin with a rephotography survey project during the late 1970s. Organized by Mark Klett, he and 4 colleagues traveled to the same locations documented by photographers of the 19th century surveys of the American West. There, they made new photographs of those sites. For Klett and his colleagues, rephotography meant accurately repeating the original camera's position, the visual composition, framing, time of year, time of day of the original photograph, while also acknowledging the participation of the photographer in making aesthetic choices. And I'm talking, this is mathematical, exactly the right spot at exactly the right time to reproduce exactly the same scene and therefore show both the photograph's constructedness and the landscape's change over time. The results say a great deal about how environments have changed over 100 years of human interaction and how visualizations are always cultural products. Let's look at, we could look at many examples, but I'll just give you one example. One striking example is Rick Dingus's rephotograph of A.J. Russell's original photograph of Hanging Rock. So this is the original Russell from 1868. Rick Dingus goes back 100 years later, and boy, it's changed. So much has changed that the landscape on the far side of the overhanging rock not only appears unfamiliar, but somehow physically improbable. This is what Dingus said at the time, quote, "I was most interested in using repeat photography to investigate not just how the camera could help us record the world changing through time, but also to examine how both the photographer and the medium of photography distort the world by rendering it as an image." Let's move on to another example. Roughly 10 years later, South Texas native Sharon Stewart published The Toxic Tour of Texas, which is where I live. A photographic journey through a state that, as she puts it, and I love this, prides itself on being the biggest, the best, and it is. Texas has the largest concentration of oil refineries and chemical plants in the nation. Texas ranks first in the United States in the amount of known or suspected carcinogens released into the environment. Her photograph of Chevron's uranium waste dump site is as much a work of beauty as it is a document of environmental destruction. Simultaneously, the accompanying text, I hope you can read that from where you're at, provides competing interpretations of the site. On one hand, we've got co-chair of the Pana Maria Concerned Citizens. His comment would seem to corroborate the contents of the image when he says that what we are concerned about is radioactive particles that go up and latch onto particles of dust or get into water from the underground. When you drink, eat, or breathe it, a certain kind of energy radiates in the body and nicks this cell, this cell again, until it's dead, changed, or growing. Or we also have the uranium operations manager at Chevron, who asks us to trust the corporation's promise of innocence and not what the photograph seems to show. We contend, Kevin Rebbe says, that we have not damaged anyone, or we will in the future. Stewart's work encourages viewers to closely consider the relationship of beauty and devastation. Beauty is also important for Dawood Bay. This is going to be difficult to see with a room with lights. It's even difficult to see in the gallery unless you're up close, and it is absolutely best seen up close. Beauty is important for Dawood Bay, but it also works to trigger a very complicated historical memory. Taking its title from a Langston Hughes poem, Bay's series, Night Comin' Tenderly, Black, imagines the perilous journey of enslaved Black Americans moving north along the Underground Railroad toward Canada and freedom. The photographs in the series were taken in Ohio, within 50 miles of Lake Erie, the final push to the border. The dark, rich hues of the tangled, inhospitable landscape seem to charge the atmosphere with a tension that is both lush and ominous. In the photograph, we see both a place and a historical memory, a portrait of experience conveyed through suggestion. Bay asks us to consider the relationship of the environment and the lasting imprints of the past. This is what he says, quote, "The experience is visualized and imagined through their eyes. So while their Black bodies may be literally absent from the images, their presence still informs the work in a visceral way." I conclude my talk tonight with two examples that bring us back to Yosemite National Park. It was there, while teaching a photography workshop in 1976 at Ansel Adams Photography Workshop, that the idea for Roger Minnick's Sightseer series came to him. That's a hard one. I've never said it aloud, like Sightseer series. Try to say it fast 3 times. Photography students, he later recalled, and this goes back to Nicole's talk, Minnick would say, photography students that he was teaching would gather at the famous Inspiration Point Outlook, and listen to how he puts it. They'd prop their cameras on the tripods, wait for the grand man, i.e. Ansel, himself to move along the line, bestowing his blessings on each student's composition and choice of exposure. The cacophony of clicking shutters would then follow, with the result, of course, that all students ended up taking nearly identical images. It wasn't long, however, before Minnick became aware of something else happening, much more interesting. Waves of tourists were continually arriving at the Overlook's parking lot in cars, buses, and motorhomes, thrusting their way through the gauntlet of photographers, not only for a clear view of the famous vista, but for the obligatory snapshot of themselves proving they were there. I'm sorry, I'm laughing because this is like the key point of Nicole's talk earlier, one of her key points. For the next several years, Minnick dedicated himself to photographing what he describes as a new genus, Sightseer Americanus. The result is a poignant series of how ordinary people interact with the environment. And my gosh, isn't that great? I mean, the multiple layers of photography embedded in both the photograph of the landscape, but also the scarf that she's wearing. The last image I want to look at in photography I want to talk about is Richard Mistrak, who also taught at the Adams Photography Workshop. He was a buddy, a student, kind of an informal student of Minnick's when they're at Berkeley. And Mistrak identifies Ansel Adams as having a major impact on his own career. well known for his large-scale color photographs of the American West, especially those landscapes that have borne the destruction brunt of human impact. Misrak is both generous and critical of Adams in a way that I find productive. He says this, quote, "You don't want more people making Ansel Adams photographs. You want people to take your legacy and then build on it. He gave me the tools to go off and just do something completely, radically different." And this is the photograph that he lent us for the show. The tools that Adams gave Misrak are both technical, the use of large format cameras, and what he calls a fetishism for the print. If Adams was famously fetishistic about his print, Misrak also is, and he gladly acknowledges that. He really, really, really cares about the beauty of the print. He's not going to hang something on the wall that he himself is not blown away by. So that's something for us to talk about. The importance of beauty for Misrak is as important as it was for Ansel Adams, as well as conceptual. Namely, Misrak also shares an appreciation for the power of beauty to evoke feelings and political action. But the direction is indeed quite different. The photograph that he loaned us for the show, Yosemite After a Forest Fire, demonstrates this quite well, I think. Where Adams strove to visualize the environment through the prism of pristine nature, Misrak confronts the often destructive ways that environments change, in this case by a lightning strike 1 year earlier. The results, to my eye at least, are evocative of the opportunity and stakes at the heart of environmental photography today. Thank you.
Thank you. What a tour de force. Adams' predecessors, Adams, stunningly beautiful, and also Adams' legacy. It is almost as if we had been able to travel all the way to Austin to look at the exhibit you put together. While you right here are thinking about questions, I can say that you out there at home behind screens can also ask questions. And if you are on the amerikahaus YouTube channel, you should see a QR code. And then just do as, you know, what we do with QR codes. And then that should direct you to slido.com and hashtag amerikahaus. And then you can punch in your questions. And I will make sure to get as many to Steve as I can. But if there are questions right here in analog fashions, let me know. And I get my... Yes, please. There's a question right here.
Yeah, hi. Would you please comment on the real-world consequences of Ansel Adams' style of photography? I'm thinking of NGOs adopting his style in conservation, like World Wildlife Fund, and till today they show pictures void of people, just pristine nature. And people like Bernhard Jimek, maybe you know him, a famous animal filmmaker in Germany, they even cleared the African savanna of people to shoot their movies. So this is not only a question of aesthetics. What do you think?
Well, this brings us back to Joshua's early paper this morning, that I agree that today that perspective is insufficient as a way to help address environmental issues. If folks are using that, they're going to make that choice. It's not the one that I would. I feel like a photograph like this, for instance, is much more evocative today of addressing environmental issues than a pristine wilderness view by Ansel Adams. For me, that's pretty clear. At the same time, what I don't want to do is throw Ansel Adams out and say, we shouldn't do this anymore, therefore, there's something inherently problematic with this photo. I disagree with that viewpoint. I think that the groundwork that he laid was important in many ways, and from my view, it's too easy to throw him out. But to your question, I would absolutely in no way endorse the use of such photographs for environmental publications like that.
The Slido option takes a little while because you need to punch it in and type it, but as for here, the floor is open. Blown away by the beauty of it all. Yes. Wait for the microphone, please. Andrew Estes. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the really nice talk on Ansel Adams. I don't know too much about his biography, but you said that for his images, that in his own mind, at least when he was conceiving them, it was a sort of personal relationship with the wilderness, and then they were used for conservation later on. Mm-hmm. I just wondered if, when you look at Adams, what he said about how much his pictures led to people in America visualizing themselves as Americans, as sort of to become a nation through these images, through our state parks and whatnot. I'm just wondering how much consciousness that Adams had about what he was doing as a sort of nation building as he was producing these photographs.
I would be hesitant to claim that he was really interested in nation building. Now, it is true that he, beginning in 1940, began working for the federal government to produce large-scale photographs of national parks that would then be perhaps used to help unify the United States. But I don't think that's what he was interested in. I take him at his word. I think and we might criticize him for this. Well, where are your politics, Ansel? I think he was trying to make the most beautiful photographs he could. And one of the first people who criticized him was Henri Cartier-Bresson, who said, I forget exactly the year, it was around this time, the world is falling apart, and you and Edward Western taking photographs of rocks? So that criticism of him, I think, has been out there. But he's gonna shake, he's gonna go, oh, well, you then make a photograph of social injustice. I'm gonna make photographs in the most beautiful places I can, because this means a lot to me personally. And then this is also someone, photography was really different at that time. The man was struggling economically. He was barely getting by. Later in his life, once he started selling postcards and books and postcards, he began licensing his images, then money started to come his way. But this is a person who was just scrambling to make ends meet pretty much all the way through his career. And that is what's on his mind. He is not, to the best of my knowledge, really thinking grandiosely about nation building. Now, it's not to say that other people maybe haven't used his photographs that way, but that would not have been a motivator for him.
Ingrid Gessner.
Thank you so much, as always, Steve. When I was looking at the picture you showed us taken by Cedric Wright of Ansel Adams, and I looked at the timestamp and it said 1942, I was immediately reminded that this was the same year that Ansel Adams also went to Manzanar internment camp and photographed Japanese Americans, many of whom were American citizens at the time, and took those kinds of pictures. And if you could comment on, I know, it's a total different thing, but since we're talking about the social aspects of aesthetic pictures, I was wondering how can we reconcile that? And I was wondering, I didn't know that he was doing this in the middle of World War II.
Well, he and also with Dorothea Lange was also making photographs of internment camps, and this was a federal government commission for him. I didn't include any of those in the show. I mean, I maybe could have because they're owned by the federal government, so therefore the American people, and I could have printed them myself. Exhibitions at the Ransom Center really are focused on materials that we have, and so I really wanted to focus on our collection and focus on the environment. But it is true that he was, that's really a whole nother story. And they've been criticized. The photographs have been criticized by being too, gosh, everything is pretty good here. It's not so bad. And I feel like those criticisms are reasonable if you look at the photographs. And I think Dorothea Lange is much more direct and hard-hitting on this. But of course she's going to be. This is what she's trained to do. I mean, or training herself to do as a social documentary photographer. She is very committed to social issues, especially leftist issues. This is going to be really hitting her. Adams is there on assignment, and he's doing the work that the federal government wants him to do. And so, how is that connected to the environmental work? I mean, it has both the same sort of apolitical quality to it, I think.
Nicole Schneider.
Thank you so much for your talk, and thank you so much for bringing us back to our discussions over the day. I really appreciate that. I have not so much a questions, more kind of points that I'm interested in. So I'm wondering if you might talk about those a little bit more. And one again is this idea of the manufactured environment that we've been talking about so much, the way that the idea is created, but then also how the pictures are very much artistically created. And if you could just elaborate on that a little bit more. And then you mentioned, and that kind of goes into the direction of the last question as well, the social injustice, social justice. And I see so many connections in these photographs also to all of those issues. I'm just wondering where you see those, or if you see those.
Well, it's interesting because I'm not exactly sure where this comes from. And maybe you could help me out, Joshua, but for a long time, there was a view that the most honest, direct, realistic way to make a photographic image was black and white. And that emerges through the era of social documentary photography, the rise of the major news magazines, and that belief really held for a long time. Of course, that is like the most abstract thing that one can do. But I think there has been a belief that this is just really accurate the way reality is. And also, if you look at the hyper focus that he has, I mean, the incredible depth of field, and everything is crisp, I think it does give the images a sense of reality. But the quote that I read to you when he's looking at that 1944 storm, and it's just like, this is all just constructed, basically. And he basically says that also in his reflections on Monolith, that what he saw there was not there when he's hanging on the ledge, looking at Half Dome, was not what he felt. And what he felt was this dark, brooding form. Well, how do you get that? Well, you put a rat and red filter on, and it changes the nature of the sky. And then you burn and dodge like crazy in the dark room to make it look jet black. So it is an interesting phenomenon that it on one hand, the photographs might seem realistic, but they are deeply constructed, and he is the first person to admit that. So the second question about social change and social justice, I mean, he's so different, than Misrak. This is where Misrak really goes in a different direction. Like, Misrak is appalled at the massive landscape changes, the environmental changes in the American West, and he's made it, not all of his photographs take that on, but a lot of his photographs take that on. Or the pollution of Cancer Alley, I mean, I know that well. I used to live at what we call the apex of Cancer Alley in Baton Rouge, and it is as brutal as Misrach and Orff make it out to be. His border cantos are also very political. That's really missing in Adams. And I think for a lot of younger people and photographers, that is a source of impatience because they want photographs to make a stronger political stance. He's not going to. And so then I think it's sort of up to us as viewers. Well, what do you make of that? And I don't know, for me, working this exhibition was just so interesting because of the wide variety of viewership. People my age, I mean, I remember the first time I encountered Ansel Adams was in an American Studies class in 1985, I think. And we read William Cronin's first book, but also all these poems and just all this great work on the American wilderness. But what really stood out to me were Ansel Adams' photographs, and they were just so powerful and so strong, and they really, for me and people my generation, they define what environmental photographs are. That is not the case of most American 20-year-old college students. They don't know them. And so I felt that part of my job was to help. I wanted to both defamiliarize them, but also make them familiar. I mean, at the same time, I wanted to bring them to a new audience. They care a lot about the environment, and they're going to really kind of relate to this. But I wanted them to see where this really comes from, and Ansel Adams plays a really important role in that. So it's sort of like getting back to my answer to your question. I'm very critical, very much so, of the use of his photographs in certain ways today. But I just think it'd be a terrible mistake to just throw it out because of the important role that he played in history of photography. And also, I mean, my view, you all have your own individual views. They're amazingly beautiful. And I don't know, there's sometimes that I just need something beautiful to look at.
There's a question in the back.
Sorry, this question is maybe a bit of a departure, but I just wondered if you could speak a little bit to the GIS technology that you were using and kind of quite what your intentions were for using it and maybe how it interacts with the photos.
Well, thank you very much. Let's see. Could you help me pull up? I'm not sure which. I had it loaded up on one of these web browsers. Oh, yeah, there it is. Great. Thank you. So I wanted something that would last after the exhibition had closed, but also to help prepare people for it. And I don't know. I mean, I suppose I could have really tried to put a book together, but I also wanted something more interactive that would be useful for people who might not want to pick up a book. So that's the idea behind this. So there's a link to this to the Ransom Center homepage, and you can just pull it up right now if you type ransom.center/GIS. This will come up. And it's a summary of the exhibition, all this sort of preamble, blah, 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 all this. So here's a map. Let's see how quickly this will load up of all the different sites. And then across the top here, these are the different galleries in the exhibition. So I told you about the Sierra Club outing, his focus on Yosemite, environmental inspiration. And if we look at one of these, let's look at the Sierra Club outing, for instance. Let's see. So there's my text from the gallery. And then this is what we have. This is the photograph that Adams took of the commissary. And again, using satellite imagery, topographical maps, we were able to, well, me, a wunderkind who is both an artist and a computer expert who knows GIS inside and out, translated the photograph into this, this reality, that three-dimensional reality that you then can kind of play around with if you want. And every single photograph in the exhibition is like this. Again, with the point being that this is based on today's data. If you were to go to the same point today, it would look pretty close to this. And then, again, every one of these is visualized this way. And then what we also did, now you mentioned the difficulty of permissions. Try working with the Ansel Adams Trust Foundation if you want to have a hard time with permissions. Now, we own these photographs in the collection, so we can put them on the wall. But to do this took some work, but they signed off on it. They also signed off on us using excerpts from his book, Legacy, The Making of 40 Photographs, in which he described what it was like to make this. And we then embedded this into the GIS. So let's see if this will work.
1.
Oh, good.
Monolith. Face of half dome. I turned to the face of half dome. When we arrived about noon, it was in full shadow. In early mid-afternoon, while the sun was creeping upon it, I set up and composed my image. I was using a slightly wide-angled Tessar formula lens of about 8.5-inch focal length. I did not have much space to move about in. An abyss was on my left, rocks and brush on my right. I saw the photograph as a brooding form with deep shadows and a distant, sharp white peak against a dark sky. The only way I could represent this adequately was to use my deep red Raton No. 29 filter, hoping it would produce the effect I visualized. Over the years, I became increasingly aware of the importance of visualization, the ability to anticipate, to see in the mind's eye, so to speak. The final print while viewing the subject makes it possible to apply the numerous controls of the craft in precise ways that contribute to achieving the desired result. I can still recall the excitement of seeing the visualization come true when I removed the plate from the fixing bath for examination. The desired values were all there in their beautiful negative interpretation. This was one of the most exciting moments of my photographic career.
So we also have them in the gallery accessible by QR codes. And I will say the Trust is really picky about this, and they should be, because his images have been ripped off all over the place. And so, although it took a lot of work to receive permission, they came through time and time again. So I just want to acknowledge our intense gratitude for them allowing us to do this. But then we also did it for the 19th century folks. So we can go to, the Haynes photograph from, let's see how long this takes to load up. Well, okay. I mean, it's a big file, and so that's the challenge of loading this up here. So the point of this was to help, the point of this was to provide material for people after they are at the exhibition, but also to help get them ready for it. There it is. And so part of this also was, I suppose, inspired by Mark Klett, and the idea of going back to the same spot.
It seems to be a dream of people to do that. We had a lot of fun in class playing around with the tool you designed. But there's another question here. Christoph.
Yeah, I would like to know a bit more about the exhibition. Would you call it a successful exhibition in terms of the number of visitors? What was their main interest in coming there? Did you receive any comments that point in that direction of what we discussed today, or were they just admiring the pictures? And perhaps what would you change for the next exhibition?
Oh, great.
You're not a curator, I know. But
well, that's a great question. Thank you so much. I don't know. Yeah, I think it was incredibly successful. The numbers of visitors. So I want to just pull up one here while I'm at it. The numbers of visitors were the highest that the Ransom Center's had in about 10 years for that exhibition. Ansel Adams is a big draw, but also the environment is a big draw. It's open to the public. The Ransom Center is free to visit, and so anybody can come through the exhibition space. But it also is a place for a lot of classes. I just don't even know how many classes. I mean, dozens every week we're going through the exhibition. I've only heard positive things from it. I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe people are hiding the negative things from me, but it was very, very well regarded, and of course that brought a lot of satisfaction. Now, one of the things that, I mean, are you a faculty member here by any chance?
We're not at the American Institute, but LMU.
LMU, okay. So at LMU, how do you measure faculty productivity?
Oh. But the number of hours I spend in the office? No, there's no objective measure.
Okay, in the United States, we're getting pretty intense about this, and you'll know what I'm talking about. I mean, the number of articles, the number of books, the number of essays, it's count, 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 count. And the two main metrics of faculty productivity are academic analytics and Google Scholars. Either of them take on exhibitions. In other words, this is all bonus stuff. And so you only need to be at a point in your career where you don't have to have the bean counters on your back to do this. So that's just part of the issue about doing an exhibition for somebody in my position. It really is, my productivity is measured through academic analytics by the number of articles and books that I publish. But I don't, at this point I can do this. And I also reckon, this is your question about the exhibition, by far more people have put their eyes on this than any book I've written or any article that I've written. And that brings me a lot of satisfaction, I gotta say. Now, what would I do differently? I wish I had more gallery space, and I would have made it global. We're fortunate the Ransom Center, it's an amazing collection, and I could have easily quadrupled the size of the exhibition if I had more space, and I would have done it more globally. Because I had really only those 3 rooms, I had to make the hard decision right away to narrow it to the United States. And that was fine. It did put some limits on it. But were I to do it again, I would much prefer to make it global.
The last question is mine. Would you say, I'm thinking of other really important photographers, Edward Steichen and others, who were famous once and had exhibitions that toured the world, and then somebody says, oh, this is really not cutting edge anymore, this has this point of criticism, and sometimes rightfully so, and then they fall into disregard until someone comes up and said, wait a minute, there's something to be gained, to be gleaned from this. So is Ansel Adams back in style? Is that a renaissance?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I'm not sure among contemporary photographers. I think the viewing public, in a way, he's sort of always been there because of the intense output from the Adams Trust of the books, the calendars, the posters, and so on. But again, a lot of young people hadn't really recognized him as an artist, and so I do feel that did play, I think that did have an impact.
Played a role for Misra.
Yes. Before we go, this is for Konahar. Yes. So I loved the presentation of the photograph from 1880 and the use of a photography to combat environmental sort of injustice, degradation through this lawsuit. A very similar example, and I wanted to just share this with you all, and this is in the exhibition, I didn't have time in my presentation, was the special report of the New York State Survey of Preservation of Scenery of Niagara Falls of 1879. What they did, now George Barker was not a no-name photographer. He was an A-list photographer, but he was an A-list studio photographer who was selling beautiful pictures of Niagara Falls to tourists. But the New York Commission hired him to photograph the degradation of the scenery surrounding Niagara Falls. So it is also an early example, one of the earliest ones that I could find, of using photography in the 19th century specifically to call out environmental degradation. I mean, again, Thomas Easterly wasn't doing that. He was just sort of like, God, this is weird, this is terrible, but there was no real attention to that. But this is a really good example, again, of what you call the sort of proto-activist perspective of the use of photography for environmental issues. So,
I hate to say, time is more than up. Nicole has earlier thanked all speakers and the audience. I would simply like to repeat that with particular stress, and a thank you to Steve. But I want to end on thanking the amerikahaus staff. We have had a wonderful day here. We've been well fed, well taken care of. Everything has worked. So thank you, speakers. Thank you, audience. Thank you, amerikahaus staff, and have a good night.